right. Well, hello, everybody. My name is Jeff Keck, and this is the Hill Review. And today we're going to be in Exodus chapter 3. So last week we moved from Psalm 42 over to this week, Exodus chapter 3. Now, this isn't entirely, by the way, welcome to Panic at the Pumps 2017. That's right. Panic at the Pumps 2017. If you haven't filled up your gas tanks yet with fuel, you better rush out and get yourself in a 1 hour line so that you can fill up the tank so that you can contribute to the loss of gas in the gas station gas tanks. Now, don't worry about the fact that the gas station is going to be refueled at its normal schedule. Don't worry about that. Go in there, get in line, wait for an hour and a half, and fill up those tanks. You don't want the end of the world to come too soon. All right, so that's make sure you get yourself to your nearest pump and start your panic. Anyway, back to what we're talking about. So last week we were in Psalm 42. Now, if you remember Psalm 42, the psalmist was really kind of down. His heart and his soul was in turmoil. He was depressed. He was separated from the dwelling place of God. He was oppressed by his enemies right there in front of him, questioning him, "Where is your God? Where is your God?" Now, we also mentioned in class last week that Psalms was originally divided into 5 books, corresponding with the first 5 books of the Bible. So Psalm 1 to 141 was the Genesis books of Psalm, and Psalm 42 to 72 was the Exodus book of Psalm. So it really is not surprising, and it really makes sense to transfer our study over to the book of Exodus now. In Psalm 42, our psalmist was dejected, our psalmist was depressed, and he felt comfort in the worship of God. In Exodus, we're going to be in chapter 3 to begin with. And in chapter 3, we see somebody else who's a little bit in turmoil and having a little bit of an issue, but finds himself comforted in God. So let's read, or let's get right into this study here. Now, the first 3 chapters, what happens in the first 2 chapters of Exodus, actually, if you'll recall, there is a new leader of Egypt that comes in, and that's Pharaoh. And he doesn't know Joseph the way the old Egyptian leaders knew Joseph. Remember, Joseph rose to power, but he doesn't know Joseph as well. And so these descendants of Joseph, which are Israelites, begin to populate, and they begin to increase in number. They're living in Egypt right now, and they begin to increase in their population, which kind of worried the Pharaoh. So the Pharaoh did a couple of things to increase his control, Egyptian control over the Israelites. Number one, he oppressed the Israelites with hard labor. So he made them slaves and oppressed them with hard labor. He also further tried to initiate a population control mechanism, which was genocide, basically, which was killing all the newborn baby boys, but to spare the baby girls. So that was his form of population control there. Yet God was merciful to his people still, and the 2 midwives that Pharaoh had ordered to kill all of the newborns, Sifra and Puah, those 2 midwives, God had put in their hearts not to do that. So they disobeyed Pharaoh's command and chose not to do that. And so then we see the birth of a little boy by the name of Moses. And Moses' mother hid him for 3 months, if you'll remember. And again, in contrast with the order of Pharaoh, she hid him for 3 months, and then she could no longer safely hide him as he was starting to grow. But remember, she put him in a basket of reeds, placed him in the Nile River, and just sent him on his way. As luck would have it, the daughter of Pharaoh found the child and took pity on the child. If you remember, brought the child in, and then employed Moses' real mother to raise Moses, to raise this baby. So there we see that Moses gets an Egyptian raising. He's raised as an Egyptian and learns the Egyptian cultures, yet he is an Israelite. Um, and so thus begins the life of Moses. And throughout this time, Moses, as he grows up, he kills a Roman guard who was oppressing one of his Israelites, and then he flees to avoid the consequences for this action that he did. He flees, he gets all the way out to a land called Midian, where he spends the next 40 years of his life. He finds he is united with his wife Zipporah out there, the son of Jethro, and spends 40 years out there, which brings us into chapter 3 of Exodus and our study for today. So in chapter 3 of Exodus, our study begins in verse 4, but I'll read the first three verses of chapter 3 also. It says, "Meanwhile Moses was shepherding the flocks of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian. He led a flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God, also Mount Sinai. Then the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire with a bush. As Moses looked, he saw that the bush was on fire, but was not consumed." So Moses was he was a dreamer, you know. I mean, he was a smart man. He was an educated man. There was not a lot of things in life that would surprise Moses, if that makes any sense. Verse 3, "So Moses thought, I must go over there and look at this remarkable sight. Why isn't the bush burning up?" So being an educated man, growing up in Egypt, learning the cultures of Egypt in what we would consider modern at that time, modern Egypt, there's not a lot of things in life that would surprise Moses. So a bush that was on fire and was burning, but yet not being consumed, was something that would turn Moses' head, and it would make Moses think exactly that. That bush is not burning. I wonder why. You know, I think God has to use things sometimes that are consistent with us, things that would make us turn our heads. And sometimes we're so stubborn, our hearts are so hard, that those things that make us turn our heads is that turmoil and that distress that we are in, as we discussed last week. And sometimes it just takes that. But Moses, he was a smart man. Nothing would really turn his head. But the God got him to turn his head with a bush that wouldn't burn, which leads us into our lesson starting in verse 4. "So when the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him." Now listen to this. When the Lord finally saw that Moses had turned to look, God had gotten his attention, right? And so he turned to look. And he says, he called out from the bush, "Moses, Moses." Now Moses, being extremely obedient to God, at this point immediately responds, "Here I am." "Do not come closer," God said. "Remove the sandals from your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy ground." You know, we as people, we are included in the divine purposes of God. If you look all throughout history, and if you look through the genealogy of Christ, you start to see that human beings are placed in positions in which God can use them for his purpose. Moses was no different here. He was set apart. He was used for God's purpose here. Think back for a second, because this is going to play in with the rest of our study today, but think back for just a little bit what we just read, or what we just talked about in the first two chapters of Exodus. Moses was placed in a basket as a baby and sent down the Nile River. He was placed in a basket and sent down the Nile River. And his life was entrusted to God. And God took care of him. Think about that for a second. This isn't by chance. Pharaoh's daughter picked up the basket with the baby and unknowingly hired Moses' own mother to raise him. So God is amazing when he puts things together. 1 Corinthians 3:9 says that we are God's co-workers. You know, God allows us, he asks us, he invites us to come and labor with him to accomplish his purposes. And that's an amazing thing to think about. It goes on and says, do not come any closer. Remove the sandals from your feet, which is a sign of respect, for dignity, for royalty, things like that. But remove your signs from your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. Understand this, there was nothing holy about the place where Moses was standing at that time. Folks, there's nothing holy about the place you go to church on Sunday. There's nothing holy about the place you go to life group. There's nothing holy about your house. But what makes this holy at this time is the fact that God stands there. That's it. That's the only thing that makes the place holy. Basically, God is saying here, remove your sandals in respect, because I am God, and I am here, and I am standing here. Therefore, because I stand here, this place is holy. And the Hebrew word holy here, the Qadas, Q-A-D-A-S or Q-A-D-A-S-H, depending on how you, I guess what verb form it is. But Kaudash is, it means literally, it means it was set apart. The word's been used to be consecrated, to be dedicated, to be holy. But literally, this ground, because God's presence was there, was set apart for God and for his purposes. Moving on, verse 6, and he continued, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac and Jacob. Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. And rightfully so. And we know later in Scripture that when when Moses saw a glimpse of the back of God's face, how he had aged. So we know that it was dangerous for him to look at God directly. He hid his face. And that's good. Moses was humble and he was afraid. And so when God identified himself through the genealogy of who he is, Moses was afraid and hid himself. Then the Lord said, I've observed the misery of my people in Egypt. Understand this, God never misses us. He never misses a thing. He observed the people, the misery of the people in Egypt. He's heard them crying out because of their oppressors. He knows about their sufferings. In verse 8 he says, I have come down to rescue them from the power of the Egyptians and to bring them from that land to a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the promised land, if you will, the territory of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. See, rescue, the Hebrew word for rescue describes a sudden snatching away. God says, I'm here to snatch away my people from the oppression of the Egyptians. Verse 9, so because the Israelites called for help, I have also seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. Therefore, go, I am sending you to Pharaoh so that you may lead my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. Verse 9, his command to Moses, go. See, God was aware of all the sufferings of his people. Moses was aware of the sufferings as well, and Moses probably might have been thinking the same thing that the Israelites were thinking, like, where have you been? How come you've taken so long? But in any case, God has spent his time developing and raising Moses for this purpose. And so now it's time, and God says, I'm sending you. I'm sending you. And so Moses turns around and he says, absolutely, I'm gone. I'm out of here. Whatever you want me to do, I'm doing it right now. No, that's not what Moses said. You see, Moses had been prepared by God. Think about what would happen if Moses had been aborted, had been part of that genocide, had been killed. If his basket had flowed on down the Nile and just kept on moving on. What would have happened? A lot of things would have not happened. Several books of this Bible would have not been written. The people of Israel would have not been led. But God had prepared Moses for this. And Moses' response in verse 11, but God asked, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and that I should bring the Israelites out of Egypt? So even despite the fact that God had showed himself to Moses, God had a burning bush that wasn't burning, it wasn't consumed by the flames. And God had told him verbally, I am the God of your fathers. Even though God had revealed himself physically, Moses says, who am I? He argues with him. See, Moses began to believe the lie that Satan tells us. This is what we talked about last week. The lie that Satan tells us. He's the master of the lies. And the lie that he's telling Moses is that you're not good enough, Moses. You're not good enough to do this task. And so Moses begins to question God. Well, who am I? In verse 12, he said, I will certainly be with you. God told Moses, I will certainly be with you. And this will be a sign to you that I am the one who sent you. When you bring the people out of Egypt, you will all worship God at this mountain. Then Moses asked God, if I go to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me, and they ask, what is his name? What should I tell them? See, Moses is still a little bit of apprehensive here. He's like, okay, God, I believe you. I mean, you got a burning bush that's not consumed. You're actually talking to me. You are the God. But, hey, let me start my excuses of why I shouldn't do this. First of all, who am I? I'm nobody. And secondly, how am I going to prove to them who you are and that you are the one that sent me? Okay, so his second question, well, what should I call you when I get there? And God replied, Moses, I am who I am. And this is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. Just that alone defines God. God just defines himself. But I am who I am. So tell them that I am has sent you. Okay, so Moses is cool with it now, right? Nope. Verse 13, Moses said, please, Lord, send someone else. Then the Lord burned in anger against Moses. And he said, isn't Aaron the Levite your brother? I know that he can speak well, and also he is on his way to meet you now. He will rejoice when he sees you. You will speak with him and tell him what I say. I will help both of you. I will help you and him speak, and will teach you both what to do. He will speak to the people for you. He will serve as a mouth for you, and you will serve as God to him. And those verses 13 and 16 I just read was actually from chapter 4. I forgot to tell you, we flipped over a chapter here, but here's Moses again, arguing again with God. Lord, please send someone else. We saw him in chapter 3, verse 11 say, who am I? Chapter 3:13 says, where are you? Who are you? Who am I supposed to say you are? If you were to look at chapter 4, verse 1, he says, what if they don't believe me, God? What if they don't believe me? And now here he is. Actually, before this, in verse 10, he says, I am not an eloquent speaker. I'm not eloquent. And then here he is again in verse 13, Lord, please just send somebody else. How many times do we sit there and we have a call of God, and God has called us to do something, and we sit there and we come up with excuses and reasons why we're not to do that, or we don't want to do that, or we are just not qualified for that. The devil puts us in this position where he lies to us all the time, and we have a choice to believe it or not to believe it. And if we believe it, we will sit there and we will argue with God on a consistent basis, and we will tell God, you know what, hey, you really need to pick somebody else. Who are we to do that? We think we know best. We think that we can be in charge of our lives, but the truth of the matter is the devil is telling us a lie, and we are believing it. And God has called us. God has called us to follow him. Moses, there shouldn't be 2 chapters worth of argument here. When God said, I'm sending you to free my people, Moses should have said, yes, Lord, as you wish. Tell me when to go, how to get there. And that should have been the end of the story. But he argued with him like we do. And we just argue so much with God because, God, obviously you're wrong and I'm right. Think about that for a second. God spends a lot of time preparing us. God spent all of Moses' life preparing him for this task. And God has spent a lot of time preparing us for the tasks he's called us to. And no matter what excuse we can come up with, there's not one. He's already prepared us. And so though we don't know it, we are already prepared to go and do what God wants us to do. The answer should be, here am I, Lord. Send me. Here am I. Send me. You want me to go somewhere? I'm yours. Think about that for a moment as you go throughout your week when God is calling you to go and do something. Just say, okay, God, you've got it all taken care of and you'll protect me. I'm going to go and I'm going to do what you've asked. Thank you, folks, for listening, and have a good week.